Hey, welcome into the inaugural episode of the Ex-Homeschoolers Club. I am your Ringmaster General, Jacob Gooden, and I figured what better way to kick off this podcast than by kind of introducing myself, sharing my homeschool journey, and really breaking down a couple myths and questions that people have around homeschooling. So, my homeschool journey started way back in 2004. I was 8 years old, and I was going into second grade. I had just moved, brand new house, brand new town, and for whatever reason, my parents thought now is the time to homeschool our kid. I'm not going to lie, I hated it to begin with, okay? I was used to going to public school. I'd gone to kindergarten and first grade in a regular classroom setting with a teacher and all of my fellow students. So 5 days a week, I was seeing my best friends. I was playing with my best friends. So to go from that to all of a sudden, I'm stuck at home 7 days a week with my mom and my sister and my dad on the weekends, it just was not great, okay? It was not what I wanted. I wanted to be with my friends. I wanted to be hanging out with them, having fun, playing on the playground, doing school together, and that just wasn't the case. But things did eventually change, and I fell more and more in love with being homeschooled. So much so that by the time I was graduating in 2014, can't believe that's been a decade ago, but by the time I was graduating, I loved it, right? I was involved in a bunch of extracurricular stuff. I had my own businesses. I was really like self-educating myself. So my parents handed me the curriculum and just said, roll with it, gave me a syllabus, and I would, turn things into them and get things graded. And, but I was really kind of self-taught and, self-sufficient. I then graduated and went to college, did college in 3 years, graduated with a bachelor's degree. And it was such a shift to go from really being like a self-reliant, self-taught person to then all of a sudden, again, I'm in those schoolroom settings. I have other students. I'm doing group projects. So it was definitely a shift, to say the least. And I missed the ability that I had in high school to really just kind of like do things on my own time. Because all of a sudden I was like, I had to be at class at a certain time. I had certain things that were due certain days, I had commitments, right? I had jobs, I had all these things. So definitely tricky. But the skills I learned in homeschooling have definitely come in clutch so many times, both in college and then after college. It's crazy. I've been out of school now for 7 years. But I'm going to break down more of my story as we go through some of these myths and talk about my experience kind of combating or experiencing some of these, right? So I think the most common myth that most homeschoolers hear is that homeschool kids lack socialization, right? We lack social skills. This can for sure be true, right? We've all met that kid who can't look you in the eye. They don't know how to shake your hand when they're talking to you. They mumble under their breath. They're hard to understand, right? And it's very clear that they just kind of want to like go do their own thing. I've been this kid. And one of the things that my family did, thankfully, to combat this was my parents pushed me to be in a bunch of extracurricular stuff, right? Which kind of plays into another myth, which is that homeschoolers don't do extracurricular activities. This, in my experience with my family and my friends, was just not true, right? We did things, we were in sports, speech and debate, dance class, music. We did all kinds of stuff outside of home, church groups, all that kind of stuff to be around other people, right? When you put yourself around other people, you start to learn what is socially acceptable and what's not. And to talk about my favorite extracurricular activity, it ended up being swing dance, to be quite honest. When I was 12 years old, my mom put me in a dance class. I absolutely hated her for it. I begged her not to go. I was 12 years old and, starting to hit puberty. I felt really weird in my body. I didn't want to be dancing with girls. I didn't want to touch girls. I didn't want to be anywhere near them, right? But within a couple weeks, it was just kind of like, I kind of fell in love with it, right? And by the time I was graduating, by the time I was 18, I loved swing dance so much so that I was helping put on school dances. I was putting on dances at my own house. I was teaching swing dance. I was like super involved in it. I learned a bunch of different styles: East Coast, West Coast, Lindy Hop, Charleston. I'd gone into ballroom dance, so I knew how to do the waltz and the tango and the cha-cha. And even was involved in some English country dancing, which if you don't know what that is, that's basically like Pride and Prejudice era line dancing. So a little do-si-do, very, very fun, also very cringy to look at. We had Our school dances were not like regular school dances where, we had a DJ or anything like that. Our school dances were very much like swing music, ballroom music, and English country dance. And we did a couple themes like sock hop, which was always super fun, very like 50s. We did an English country dance where people would dress up kind of in that like Renaissance era fashion, so big ball gowns, and guys would wear long petticoats and stuff like that. And it's funny to look back on and find photos of that and be like, we really did that. That's so cringy, uh, but I loved it. That was like my favorite thing about being a homeschool kid and my extracurricular activities, I guess. So another myth surrounding homeschooling is the idea that homeschoolers have an inferior education and that they're taught by unqualified teachers. In my experience, I don't have an inferior education. I think I have a fine education. I also have a mom who worked really hard to make sure that I had the right level of education to get to college. That was her goal from day one of homeschooling me, was I need to make sure that my kids have enough education to get into college, right? And good enough grades to get into college. I don't know if that's true of every homeschool family. That was just true of mine. My mom also had a college degree she was going to be an English teacher. So she knew how to teach kids, primarily high school and college level, but she was able to translate a lot of that into what we were doing. And so, I don't know. Again, it's one of those myths where I think it is true. I think there are parents out there who are not qualified to teach their kids. But I think more likely than not, most parents are completely qualified. And with the amount of educational resources now surrounding, like on YouTube and that colleges put out and things like that, yeah, your kid can get a great education from the luxury of their home, right? This myth of, inferior, inadequate education also plays into the myth that homeschool kids can't get into college, right? I'm living proof that that's not true. And granted, I didn't go to Harvard, I didn't go to Stanford, nothing like that, but I applied to 6 colleges and I got into all 6 and got offered scholarship opportunity on all 6 of them. I'm not a brainiac. I'm not the smartest kid in the classroom. I'm not this sharpest tool in the shed, right? But I was able to do it. I think where this comes from is that a lot of my friends, as I talk more and more to them, is like their parents viewed the education as like the goal is to get you through high school. And so there was no prep. There wasn't a lot of prep for college, right? It was like, we'll figure out when we get there. But, unlike a public school or a private school, you don't have an advisor who's walking you through the whole time you're in high school, walking you through the process of like, this is what college applications look like. This is what the FAFSA looks like. This is what college classes are going to look like, right? Here's how to prepare for it. Here's how to do community service. Here's how to make yourself look the best you possibly can, right? So I think that because of the lack of understanding from parents on that front, then it leads to a lack of homeschool kids not going to higher education or getting stuck in a community college situation, at least in my experience. That also to say, like, I had a lot of other friends who they did go to college. They did do 4-year college. Some of them are in master's degrees now. They're like doing incredible things, right? When it comes to the actual process of getting into a college, if your parents have done it right and kept transcripts and things like that, then honestly, you're not really going to have a problem because, well, like, every homeschool is kind of looked at as a private school, right? And so it's like transferring from a private school or moving on from a private high school into college. All right, let's transition a little bit. Another myth surrounding homeschoolers is that homeschooling is only done for religious reasons. I don't think this is as true anymore. It kind of plays into that like homeschooling is a new trend kind of a thing. I know people who have been homeschooled since like the 90s, since like the early 90s. But I don't think it's always for religious reasons, especially today, right? I think COVID taught a lot of parents and a lot of families that you can do school at home and it gives you sometimes the availability and the freedom to travel, right? To go see the world, to go visit grandparents. And I know that was a big part in my life too, was like, I did school at Disneyland one day, we decided, hey, let's go to Disneyland. And in between roller coasters, I would do a math test, or I would do a worksheet, or, I do some different things throughout the day, right? Kind of one of the funnest, coolest experiences I think I've ever had doing school at an amusement park, but also gave me the availability to like go visit my grandparents for a week in the middle of the school year and stay with them and do school at their house, right? Things that normal public school kids didn't have the ability to do. Another example of this is the fact that by the time I was junior, senior in high school, I was driving, I had jobs, I had my own businesses. And so I also, with homeschool, I had the freedom to say, I'm going to do school at night or late in the evening, in the afternoon. I'm going to do it on the weekend this week or whatever. And I was able to build my schedule to be a little bit more of its own, like, a little bit more of like an adult schedule, I guess you could say. Like I could go to work in the morning, or I could, have a client take guitar lessons from me at, 3 in the afternoon, kind of a thing, So it gave me more freedom to kind of do those things. Getting back into religious reasons, right? Okay. Most homeschoolers are homeschooled for religious reasons. I have a hard time pushing back on this because my experience as a homeschool kid was that of a Christian homeschooler. I was a part of Achieve, which was the Association of Christian Home Educators of Ventura County. So everybody who was a part of that, and which was most of my friends, we were all Christians, right? And even the other homeschool groups in the area were religious, whether it was Catholic or just another Christian homeschool group that maybe was a few more towns over, things like that. But so for the most part, every homeschooler I knew was a Christian. And that dictated a lot of the way we looked at education, right? Science was done from a religious aspect. So creationism versus evolution, right? Creation wins over evolution every single time, right? Looking at history, right, through a religious lens of looking at math through a religious lens, weirdly enough. Not studying other religions as much, that kind of thing. That myth kind of also lends itself to homeschool kids being sheltered, right? Which is another myth that a lot of people have. And that's like very true in the case of like religious homeschool education for the most part, because when you have that religious viewpoint, you want to protect your kids from anything that you would view as unbiblical, sinful, right? Sex, drugs, and alcohol kind of a thing. And that was true in my case. I always tell this story. I laugh about this all the time, but like my growing up, movies have bad stuff in them, right? They've got language, they've got sex scenes, they've got drug usage, they've got whatever. And so there was a website that was done by Focus on the Family, and they would rate all these movies and talk about anything that was problematic in them, right? Whether it was cuss words, language, sex scenes, immodest clothing, all that kind of stuff. And so my parents could go on and they could read a review of this movie from a Christian lens and say, yes, you can go see this, or no, you can't go see this, right? And so it lent itself to me not being able to see a lot of movies. But thankfully, I had a friend who had this DVD player that was amazing. Basically, you could put this like USB drive into it that you've downloaded files for certain movies, and you could dictate what got taken out of the movie, right? So it would bleep out bad language, it would take out sex scenes, it could skip whole scenes that involved like, drugs, alcohol, whatever. So it was great because all of a sudden we got to start watching all these movies that were deemed inappropriate or we weren't allowed to watch, but we got to watch an edited version of them. This also kind of led to some weirdness because then later watching those movies, it was like, I don't remember this scene, or I don't remember all this language being in this movie. But it was like, it was cool in the moment, right? Especially when you're a kid and you're like, well, I want to go see this movie, and you can't, right? Because mom and dad say it's got too much bad language in it. Sorry. I think the sheltered thing, it's hard. I understand parents want to protect their kids, right? They want to keep them safe from the big bad world. But I think that it also can hinder their kids a lot of times. And So what I always encourage people to do, and my family is not the perfect family to look at for this, because it hasn't been until recently where we've been really open with each other to talk about things like sex, like addiction, like alcohol, things like that, religion, even, to explore ideas openly with one another and have conversation and have debate around those things. And so rather than shelter your kids from a lot of things, I think it's almost better to be open, because a lot of that stuff is out in the world, right? But be open and have an environment for your kids where it's safe for them to talk to you about, well, why is this bad? Or why do we view this as wrong? Or why is this good and this is bad? And, all these different things. So, anyway, I'll get off my soapbox when it comes to that. But I don't think that all homeschooling is done through the lens of like, it has to be religious. I think that is, I think that was a period of time for sure, but I think now less so. And yeah, I don't think all homeschoolers are sheltered, but I do think there's a good number. Lastly, getting into our final kind of myth is that homeschoolers are lazy and lack discipline. I really don't think this is true. From my experience, it's not true. My mom had to work really hard to get us on a schedule. I'll give her that, but we got there, right? It took a couple years, but we figured out this is how we operate in school. This is when this happens. This is the time frame, all those types of things. So much so that by the time I was entering junior high and high school, a lot of my education really just came from my parents handing me a syllabus and a textbook and saying, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to read this textbook. You're going to fill out these worksheets. You're going to turn them in. And, depending on where your grades are at, we can come back and review with you or not. If you're getting straight A's, well, we don't need to, because obviously you understand the information. So they put a lot of that expectation and need to kind of self-discipline yourself to get things done on me, which that is not lazy, right? That is the opposite of lazy. I had a lot of discipline when it came to, I've got to turn in XYZ by certain times. I also, by the time I was finishing high school, worked multiple jobs. I owned my own business. I did odds and ends jobs for people too. And so I had kind of arguably like an adult schedule, right? I had places that I had to be at certain times, and I was responsible for all of that. I was not relying on my parents to get me there on time. I had my own car, so I was not relying on, can I borrow the car to have it at this time, And then I had the expectations of school and applying for college, right? So there was deadlines associated with all of that stuff. And when I dropped the ball, that was my responsibility. So for instance, I dropped the ball in Spanish, so much so that it became, well, you're going to have to do Spanish during the summer, right? You got to make this up. That was on me. That was my laziness. But, I really don't think that homeschoolers are lazy. There are stories, obviously, of people who, they claim they're homeschooling their kids, and they're not. They're just letting their kids sit around the house all day and watch TV. I think that's very few and far between. My experience with me and my friends was like, we were all super, super responsible. And, we took our education pretty seriously, I think, for most of us. But, I can't say that's part of what this podcast is for, is to talk to people and find out their own experiences. But overall, I don't think that myth is true. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite, because to be a homeschool family, you really do have to have discipline and not be lazy, because there's no school bus coming at 6 a.m. to pick you up. It is, you got to get your butt out of bed and get yourself to the dining table or the schoolroom or whatever to get things done. So anyway, that's just a couple of the myths and questions that people have surrounding homeschool. I'm excited for this season. If you haven't seen the trailer, this season I'm interviewing all my best friends from growing up, and we're asking questions around their homeschool experience and the good, the bad, and the ugly of it, right? It's not all rainbows and unicorns. So I'm really stoked for you guys to hear it. If you enjoyed this episode, please, follow, subscribe, leave a rating if you feel so inclined. But I'm really stoked for this season. It's going to be a lot of fun. And until next time, I'll see you guys.